Like, why are we doing this? Like, what's the whole point? Like, doing what? Exactly what are you talking about? Like, it's so unfair. Like, England is, like, taxing our stuff, and we're not even getting a fair say in it. Like, it's unfair. We started this Sons of Liberties Club thing, and we're not even doing anything. I see your point, but, like, England just stopped taxing us over this other stuff, so we should probably, like, just, like, sit back and be happy with it. Or we could just dress up like Indians and go raid this new British tea ship that just came in. You know, now you're thinking. Let's go. Hey guys, it's been a while, as you can tell. Today we're going to be discussing... Oh wait, hold on. That's better. Today we're going to be discussing the American Revolution. So let's begin. So to talk about the American Revolution, we have to get in costume. That's better. Let's begin. The American Revolution is a key part in American history. You're probably wondering, why is that? Well, it's because we gained our independence, of course. Thoughts for the American Revolution began all the way back in the French and Indian War, which was a territorial dispute between France and Great Britain, which of course Great Britain won. Once it was over, the people were kind of thinking, do we really need British people here? Like, we beat the French people. Yeah man, I see what you're talking about, but what if we just wait for the British people to leave? That could literally take forever. How about we just start a revolution, man? Everyone would get behind. Let me just call the boys. I know they'll totally get behind that. So usually with war comes taxes, and so the king thought that he could just tax the colonists via the Stamp Act, which put taxes on any land given rights or any documents by the king. This angered the colonists because I don't know why, because who doesn't love paying taxes? This led to American protests via tar and feathering. Tar and feathering was taking hot tar, pouring it over a person's body, then throwing feathers. This made the person look like a chicken, but once the tar was peeled off, it left nasty boils and scars on the person's body. With all this protest going on, the king decided to repeal the Stamp Act, and instead he implemented the Townshend Acts, which were just basically taxing the colonists even more, but this time on more things, such as glass, lead, and tea. This led to more American protests, such as the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre was an American protest gone wrong. The Americans decided to throw rocks at the British, and in response, the British fired out of fear. This caused a massive hatred for the British, which inflamed the American Revolution. After this protest, the king decided to repeal the Townshend Acts except the one tax on tea. Some people were okay with this, but others, such as the Sons of Liberty, were not. The Sons of Liberty were a group of people who were willing to stand up to the king, and they decided to do this. The Sons of Liberty decided to dress up as Indians, board a British ship, and decide to throw millions of dollars worth of tea into the sea. I don't see anything wrong with that, do you? For all this lost tea, the king implemented the Intolerable Act. The Intolerable Act basically sent 3,000 more troops to Massachusetts, revoked their charter, and closed down Boston Harbor, which put Massachusetts under the direct rule of the British Empire. In order to stop the colonists from trying to retake Boston, the British thought that they were going to seize Concord. A man by the name of Paul Revere was able to discover the British plan. He rode out and warned the Minutemen, who are soldiers ready at a minute's notice, and both sides met at Lexington. At Lexington, no one really wanted to fire at each other, but someone did, which resulted in the shot heard around the world, which began the American Revolution. The colonials were beaten at Lexington but retreated back to Concord. Once the British arrived, they decided to split up and look for weapons. The colonials ambushed them and chased them all the way back to Boston. So imagine that, getting your butt kicked by a bunch of farmers. In order to prove that America was willing to fight this war, Congress instructed Benedict Arnold to go take the fort Ticonderoga. He did so with the help of Ethan Allen and the Green Mountain Boys. This was the first American victory in the American Revolution. We all know George Washington, who would later become the first president of the United States, but we're not at that part yet. Washington took command, and his first act was to try and get the British out of Boston. Washington wanted to invade Boston, but one of his generals named Henry Knox decided that it was a bad idea. So, Henry Knox took the cannons recently conquered at Fort Ticonderoga, dragged them 300 miles, so that's a long walk if you ask me, and he placed them across the harbor in Boston. Once the British woke up, they were like, were those there yesterday? They were not there yesterday. Where did they get those? I have no idea. We should probably get out of here. Oh yeah, first one of the boats are on egg. See ya. This resulted in the British leaving Boston, and Washington decided he was going to station his men at New York, because that's where the British would most likely come, and come they did. General Howe came with 32,000 men, 60 British warships, which one was equal to about a modern-day aircraft carrier. And when they hit hard. They chased Washington all the way back at the battles of Kip's Bay, Harlem's Height, and White Plains. Unlike General Howe, Washington's mentality was, I don't care how many battles I lose, just as long as I can hold my army together so we can outlast the enemy. British nobles wanted to join the fight in Americas to gain personal glory. This leads to the tale of one of Washington's right-hand men. This is Marquis de Lafayette. He was a French noble and wanted to fight for the Americans. He did not want glory, and he went with no pay just to fight with Washington at his side. At this time, Washington was stationed at Valley Forge, and this is where the British implemented their new strategy of hiring German mercenaries. These mercenaries were called Hessians, and they were stationed across Washington at Valley Forge. The European strategy at the time was that no one attacks in the winter. We just all lay down our arms and celebrate Christmas. But we're Americans, so we decided that we weren't going to follow the European style. We surprised the Hessians by Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas, and he was able to beat the British and the Hessians out of northern New Jersey. At this point, the British were pretty much losing, and they needed to end the war fast. So they decided to split the Americas in two. General Burgoyne and General Howe's plan was to march and meet each other in the center of America. This would cause American communications to be severed and to cause chaos among the 13 colonies. General Howe went for personal glory and tried to take Philadelphia, which he did, causing the Continental commerce to move to York. But Burgoyne was about to suffer a crushing defeat. General Benedict Arnold and General Gates were able to beat Burgoyne at the Battle of Saratoga, causing the French entry into the war. With what America didn't have, foreign powers were able to provide, such as France, Spain, and Prussia. You're probably thinking, why Prussia? Well, we're going to come back to that. France was able to provide America with a good navy. Spain provided supplies, and Prussia provided training. This is Frederick von Steuben. He was Frederick III's best general in Prussia. He taught the Americans how to fight in gentlemanly style combat, which is basically standing in lines and firing at each other. Does anyone see anything wrong with this? When spring had come in the Americas, Washington was ready to take Philadelphia, but he totally didn't need to, because with the French entry into the war, General Howe kind of got a little bit scared and returned all the way back to New York. Washington sent Benedict Arnold to go capture Philadelphia and to make sure that there were no British there, but Washington was about to suffer one of the biggest betrayals during the war. Benedict Arnold really wasn't in it for American freedom. He was just in it for personal glory, kind of like those European nobilities. He decided that he was going to betray Washington. Benedict Arnold kind of got the short end of the stick all throughout the American Revolution. At the Battle of Saratoga, General Gates got all the credit, and at the Battle of Fort Ticonderoga, Ethan Allen got all the credit. So he was just fed up with Congress not giving him a promotion, and he wanted to be famous. And that wasn't just how it was going to be for him. So he decided he was going to hand over West Point to the British, which was a key fort at the time. He was able to escape in the night, so he wasn't really caught for treasonous activities, and he escaped to England after the war. You might call a rotten egg or someone you don't like a Benedict Arnold, so that's a little fun fact. The British were really having a tough time at this point because they were losing, and so they needed to end the war pretty fast. So they decided that they were going to attack the South. With the help of Benedict Arnold, Savannah fell pretty easily, and Cornwallis was able to take Charleston soon after that. Thereon, Cornwallis was able to move throughout the South pretty quickly, and Congress was kind of getting a little scared. Congress had sent General Gates to stop Cornwallis, but he had failed, so Washington sent General Greene, and General Greene's idea was to lure Cornwallis away from his supply lines, forcing him to take from the civilians, and it worked. General Greene picked up more men along the way and turned to fight Cornwallis. When Cornwallis got there, he got a little scared and fired his cannons into the crowd, which killed many of his soldiers. This caused General Greene to retreat, but any time the Americans retreat, it usually is an American victory. With Cornwallis's victory, he was a little bit chicken and decided to run all the way back to Yorktown, Virginia. At this point, the Americans were getting more French aid because Rochambeau, the general for the French in the Americas, had arrived, and him and Washington were arguing which city to take. Washington wanted to take New York, while Rochambeau, the French general, wanted to take Yorktown. And so Washington was a great listener, and he decided to go with that. So Washington marched his men 500 miles all the way down to Yorktown, while using his espionage and spies to pretend that they were going to attack New York. So that's a big brain move right there. General Cornwallis's plan was to take his men and return all the way back to New York with Clinton, who was the new general of New York at the time, but General de Grasse was able to stop him. Admiral de Grasse was able to beat the British, which was completely unheard of at the Battle of Chesapeake Bay. This cut off Cornwallis's escape, and with Rochambeau and Washington showing up at the exact same time, that meant Cornwallis was trapped. The siege of Yorktown finally came to an end after 3 weeks. Cornwallis and his 8,000 men finally surrendered. This opened up peace treaty talks with the British. At the Treaty of Paris in 1783, Great Britain had to give up territory up to the Mississippi River, had to remove all their troops from the Americas, and they had to recognize American independence. So that one must have been the hardest. America had to stop tar and feathering any British loyalists, and had to pay any debts owed to Great Britain previous to the American Revolution. Spain got Florida, while France got an economic issue that their leader. So who were some people affected by the American Revolution? Native Americans were often pinned up against each other to compete for land. Even Washington sent up an expeditionary force to burn an Iroquois village that was bothering his troops. This forced the Iroquois village to relocate to Canada for protection. Another group that shouldn't go unmentioned was the African Americans. They fought on both sides of the war hoping to gain their freedom. The Americans stopped enlisting African Americans because they were afraid that the South might get a little angry, but had to start again when the British were offering freedom to anyone who joined. In turn, you had a better chance of gaining your freedom when you joined the British. So how did the Americans win? Well, they knew the terrain. That seems pretty obvious because they were all farmers and they've grown up on that land. The Americans also used this new type of tactic called guerrilla warfare. No, definitely not what you're thinking. Guerrilla warfare is basically hit-and-run tactics against the enemy. Daniel Morgan used these in the Battle of Saratoga, allowing General Gates and Benedict Arnold to ready their forces to attack Burgoyne. So you're probably thinking, how did the colonials stand up to the British Navy? Because the British had the best navy in the world. Well, don't tell that to a man named John Paul Jones. Oh, what's up guys? I finally get in this video. Yes! Alright, big moment. Alright, John Paul Jones. John Paul Jones was the father of the Navy, and he was a pirate. He was a madman. He basically went up and stole British ships, and he raided their coast, which caused Parliament to be like, I don't want to deal with this, man. Hey, let them have the Americas. John Paul Jones used these things called privateers, which basically he put a gun on whatever he could find. Oh, shoot. Whew. Where was I? Oh yes, the Americans also used espionage to the max. A man by the name of Nathan Hale was a spy in New York. He was caught by the British and hanged. His final words were, "I only have one life to lose for my country." This inspired American troops to fight harder. In Yorktown, Virginia, Washington had another spy named James Armistead. He was an African American, which made him a great spy. African Americans weren't usually thought of as a person at the time, so James Armistead was able to relay information back to Washington and give Cornwallis fake information. The British also came back in the year of 1812, but that's a story for another day. That's better. That's way better. Hey, did you guys ever hear the joke about the Liberty Bell? It just cracks me up. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Hope you learned something, and see you next time.